A quorum is now present. The June 30th meeting of the Texas Pension Review Board will come to order. Prior to starting the meeting, I would like to address a few housekeeping items for this meeting since we are meeting virtually. We encourage all participants and listeners to please mute your microphones or telephones when you're not speaking. Also, before you speak, please say your name. And should any technical issues arise, we appreciate your patience, and please know that we will attempt to resolve any issues just as soon as possible. So with that, I'll ask Ashley to please call the roll.
Just a quick question. Do we have to mute ourselves, or is it going to be done by Ashley?
Please mute yourself. That way you can unmute yourself when you're ready. Okay. Chair Stephanie Leiby.
Present.
Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Marcia Dush.
Present.
Rosie Farina Strauss.
Present.
Ernest Richards.
Present.
Sherry Shivers.
Here.
Thank you. And Christopher Zook.
Present.
Thank you.
Okay. Then next on the agenda, we'll also do roll calls for members of the public who have pre-registered to provide comments at today's meeting. Ashley, can you please call those people?
Yes. And so we have one member of the public, and that is Mr. David Stacy.
Stacy, of course.
Here. David
Okay.
Stacy's here.
Okay.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is going to be approval of the minutes from the February 6th, 2020 meeting. At this time, the chair would entertain a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
So moved.
Second. Second from Marcia Dush.
Okay, the motion has been made by Mr. Zook and seconded by Ms. Dust to suspend the reading of the minutes. Is there any discussion from the board or any comments or corrections to the minutes as circulated? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion to suspend the reading of the minutes and to approve the minutes as circulated, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The minutes will not be read and are approved as circulated. Next item on the agenda is to consider excusing the absence of Ms. Shivers from the February 6, 2020 board meeting. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion to excuse Ms. Shivers from the board meeting.
Marcia Dush, so moved.
Seconded. Ernest Richards.
Perfect. The motion has been made by Mrs. Dush and seconded by Mr. Richards to excuse Ms. Shivers from the February 6, 2020 board meeting. Is there any board discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All
Aye.
opposed say nay. The ayes have it. Ms. Shivers is excused from the February 6, 2020 board meeting. Next on the agenda are matters from the actuarial committee. And at this time, I'll call on Mr. Brainerd to walk us through this agenda item.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to ask Staff Actuary Kenny Herbold to provide the actuarial valuation report, please.
Good morning, members. This is Kenny Herbold. I'm PRB Staff Actuary. I'd like to direct your attention to page 21. That's the summary of the actuarial valuation report. A couple of items to point out here. This report includes 15 new valuations from the prior board meeting. 6 of those new valuations include discount rate changes. Majority of them are 25 basis point reductions, while there are 2 plans that decrease their discount rate by 100 or 150 basis points. So pretty large changes there. If you could stay at the top of the screen, please, top of the page. A couple more items to point out here at the top. You'll notice that both from the prior actuarial valuation column as well as the prior board meeting current actuarial valuation column, assets are generally increasing. There is, obviously there's only 15 new valuations between the prior board meeting and this meeting, so not a big shift from the prior board meeting. But this is about 50% of the plans on the list right now are reflecting 12/31/2018 valuations. The other 50% are somewhere. The majority of the other 50% are probably prior to 12/31/2018, but we do have a handful that have 2019 fiscal year ends that are being reflected. So there isn't a lot. We're not seeing any changes from 2019 or many changes from 2019. We're certainly not reflecting the recent market activity in any of this. So that's important to keep in mind. The other thing is that the numbers that we're looking at today don't reflect some additional discount rate changes that have been announced at different board meetings. Some of the bigger ones that we're aware of, Texas ERS lowered their discount rate at a recent board meeting. Austin ERS lowered their discount rate. Dallas Police and Fire Pension System also lowered their discount rate. So the next board meeting, we should see some additional changes from that as well.
Kenny, this is Marcia Dush.
Sure.
I would like to call everybody's attention to the top box and the difference between actuarial value and market value. What's pretty interesting to me there is that at this point in time, with the valuations that you've received, is that the actuarial value of assets of $289 billion is greater than the market value of assets of $282 billion, meaning there's about $7 billion of deferred losses that have not yet been reflected in the actuarial value of assets. And the actuarial value of assets is what determines the funded ratio for funding contribution purposes. And I would just point out that does not reflect what has happened this year. And even though we've had a very substantial kind of comeback from the market trough back in February and March, I'm hopeful that we'll at least get back to where we were at the beginning of the year. Which means that the amount of deferred losses could be much greater the next time we get actuarial valuations. And please correct me if I'm wrong in that concern.
No, absolutely.
Marcia,
Go ahead, Sherry.
Oh, I was just going to ask, I assume this is because of the 5-year smoothing?
Yes, yes. So some of the losses that are present there will be picked up in the next valuation, 20% of the $7 billion difference. But let's say we get a 0 return where everybody's expecting at least 7.25% or something like that. We could potentially have $22 billion in differences between actuarial value and market value the next time around.
That's true, and it'll probably be a while before we see some of those changes, right? Because so 2019, I don't have exact numbers in front of me, but I believe it was generally a fairly good year for most of our plans. So we'll see some of the some movement with market values coming up and actuarial values coming down as those deferred losses are reflected. When we start pulling in a lot of the 12/31/2019 and January 1, 2020 valuations, which hopefully we'll see a number of those at the next board meeting. But the losses or 0% returns or whatever happens in 2020 we're likely not we're not likely to see that for a couple of years, at least in this particular report, just because of the nature of the delay in reporting and that type of thing. So but it is coming. But then one of the other things that I kind of wanted to point out here is that while the actuarial value of assets is going up, you'll notice that the unfunded is also going up as well. So even with the increases in the actuarial value of assets, the liabilities are still increasing faster, right? So with having to recognize these deferred losses over the next few years, the liabilities are going to continue to grow at the same rate, essentially. So we are likely to see unfunded liabilities continue to go up even faster than the assets are going up, and so we're gonna continue to see those numbers grow over the next few years. And you can probably see some of that if we move down to the amortization period table. You'll notice that from the prior board meeting we don't have significant movement, but when we compare valuation to valuation, we do see a significant number of increases. There's a whole bunch of new plans in the infinite bucket. There's a couple, I guess I think it's 21 versus 24 that in the 40 and above, but a lot of that group kind of moved up into the infinite bucket compared to the prior valuations, and that's despite having fairly decent returns in 2018. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. I'm sorry, but so 2018, I'm getting that wrong. 2018 was a difficult year for a lot of plans, and so that's where we're seeing the reflection and the difference in actuarial versus market value, as well as those increases in some of the amortization periods. If we can scroll down a little bit farther to the plan discount rate table, as I mentioned a minute ago, 6 of the new valuations reflect discount rate changes, which we can see from the prior valuation to current value, prior board meeting to current board meeting columns, and it illustrates a general trend that we've seen to date of plans starting to lower their discount rate, and that being incorporated into these valuations. And we expect to continue to see that going forward as plans are examining capital market assumptions and looking at where they stand now. If there's no questions on the valuation report specifically, I'll move to the supplemental report on page 27. There's not a lot to talk about here. The one thing I did want to make note of is we clarified the expected depletion date column. So this is a plan reported number.
Leaving from up there?
Excuse me? Okay. So this is a plan reported number, and this is a calculation done in accordance with GASB 67. So there's a very specific methodology associated with this calculation, and you'll see that the discount rate is different than the funding discount rate for plans that have an expected depletion date. And I think it's probably useful to note that this is a GASB 67 calculation, specifically because we are seeing other depletion dates being reported in the funding valuations, not just in accounting. And as I'll talk about in a different agenda item, there could be a requirement to include this number in funding valuations in the future as well. So if there's no questions on the supplemental report, we'll move on to the contributions report on page 31. So there is one fairly significant difference in the contribution report this board meeting. It was requested at the last board meeting that we change the way in which we sort this table. So this table is now sorted by the last column in descending order. The last column is the percent of recommended contribution paid. So just as a quick reminder, the recommended contribution is primarily the 30-year rolling amortization requirement that's required to be reported in government statute. There are some plans who have an actual amortization period below 30 who don't calculate that number, so their recommended contribution could be based on where their actual their amortization period is now. But generally speaking, if a plan has an amortization period of at least 30, or the plan itself reports a number, this contribution at 30 years, that's the value that we're using here as the recommended contribution. And so you can see that it ranges from 47% as the lowest percentage to at the very bottom of the list. There's plans that are well above 100% contribution of recommended percent of recommended contribution.
Kenny, this is
yep. Go ahead, Marcia.
Marcia Dush. Can you explain the calculation of the recommended contribution? I know it's in a footnote, but I think it would be helpful to reiterate what's in the column for the recommended contribution.
Sure. So government statute requires that a plan report the contribution required to maintain an amortization period of no more than 30 years. So in most plans that are above 30 will report a rolling amortization contribution of 30 years. So every single valuation, they calculate what would be the contribution required for us to have a 30-year amortization period as of the valuation date. And that, generally speaking, that's the number that's going to be included in this column.
I know we'll be talking about a few other things down the road here, but thinking back to the beginning of the actuarial report where you showed how many more plans moved into the infinite amortization category. I am struck by the fact that I know that one of the reasons is that people have lowered, somewhat belatedly lowered their actuarial interest rate, but we have so many more plans with higher amortization periods that I'm just struck by the fact that I believe that the tools we have at our fingertips are just not serving us well in Texas, and that we do have to consider some new tools, and I think we'll be getting to that later on. But I would, one of the tools I think is right here is this, the 30-year amortization as a percentage of pay. I guess I would like to point out that in targeting a contribution rate, I would like to see something like the sponsor's normal cost plus interest on the unfunded plus 1/30 of the unfunded, rather than an amortization based on percentage of pay at the 30-year mark. So I think this is a very inefficient or insufficient recommended contribution calculation. Thank you.
Kenny.
So the other thing is that I did want to make note of is that these are, this is historical data, right? So we're comparing based off of actual contributions, comparing that against the recommended contribution from prior valuations. So the contribution type that we're looking at here doesn't reflect any recent changes associated with the recent funding policies. So we will see some of this kind of trickle in as plans have made changes to their approach to their contributions. And that's all I have prepared for the actuarial valuation reports. I'll be happy to take any additional questions.
Questions for Staff Actuary Kenny Herbold.
Hi, this is Ernest Richards. Kenny, can we go back to the supplementary table, the one prior to this? Yeah, so the supplemental report. So what is this report about? What exactly does it, information does it provide?
The supplemental report includes primarily accounting reporting information. So you'll notice the headers are total pension liability, fiduciary net position. Those are terms used under the Governmental Accounting Standards Board reporting requirements. So this is the AV report. So the first report that we looked at, where we had a summary and then additional detail, is essentially the funding reports that the plans put together. This information is the accounting information. So generally, in many cases, the information is going to be nearly identical. Mm-hmm. There are some differences in reporting timing and when the valuation occurs versus what the reporting date is. So there may be some discrepancies, but generally speaking, this is going to be accounting information instead of funding information.
Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions for Kenny? If not, let's move on to actuarial standard of practice number 4, second exposure draft. Kenny?
Okay, so we talked a little bit about this at the actuarial committee meeting in May, and I'm just going to provide a very quick overview, in part because it highlights some additional discussion that we'll be having, I believe, later in the meeting. But actuarial standard of practice number 4 is essentially the primary ASOP that governs how plan liabilities are measured for pretty much all purposes. The second exposure draft was released recently. Comments are due at the end of July. And so the way the process works is once comments are received, the Actuarial Standards Board goes through those and considers any recommended changes by its constituents. The application of a new ASOP is generally no earlier than 12 months after the date of adoption. So while we're in the process of updating the ASOP, and because comments were delayed, the original deadline was back in April, my guess is whatever changes come from this, we won't be seeing them until probably valuations with valuation dates in the middle of 2022. But it is useful to kind of keep an eye on where things are headed. And sometimes things do change between exposure drafts, but given that this is the second exposure draft, it's very likely that they won't issue a third, and the changes between this one and the next one are relatively minor. And that obviously depends on what level of comments they get from constituents and how much change is being requested and how the ASB, whether the ASB agrees with those recommended changes or not. But the items that I really wanted to point out in the second exposure draft are this concept of a reasonable ADC. This isn't something that has been included in a previous ASOP 4, and so it is kind of introducing some guidelines surrounding what is reasonable when calculating an actuarially determined contribution. And a big part of that is going to be the amortization method. So the language in ASOP 4 right now, in the exposure draft, says that an actuary should select an amortization method for each amortization base that is expected to produce amortization payments that fully amortize the amortization base within a reasonable time period or reduce the outstanding balance by a reasonable amount each year. So the key there is each base needs to be paid within a reasonable time period, or you can't have negative amortization on an existing base, right? So we've had conversations in the past about negative amortization, and generally speaking, when you're looking at plans, if their effective amortization is in the low 20s or above, it's going to be experiencing negative amortization. So as a whole, the expectation of what's reasonable and what's not is likely to move down. So based on my conversations with other actuaries, based on my reading of this, my expectation is that a 30-year rolling amortization period would no longer be considered a reasonable actuarially determined contribution or a reasonable amortization method. So there's a lot likelihood that plans that are calculating ADCs either for purposes of making a contribution or simply as their benchmark, a 30-year rolling amortization period, and even possibly a 20-year rolling would no longer be considered reasonable. And then, as I alluded to when talking about the supplemental report, there is, depending on how the contributions are determined, there's potentially a requirement to calculate a depletion date on the funding valuation. So there's a potential that we're going to see multiple depletion dates in the future, and they'll likely be different. My guess is funding valuations will be slightly longer, so the depletion date will be later because of how the calculation is likely to occur. But it's just worth noting that there may be some multiple depletion dates for the exact same plan coming down the road that will need to be we'll need to pay attention to which one they're talking about and why they're talking about it. I'd be more than happy to take any questions on that.
Questions on ASOP 4, second exposure draft for Kenny. In general, I think it's safe to say that the actuarial profession is working to tighten things up and reduce amortization periods. Over the longer term, that's going to increase costs of amortizing unfunded liabilities. Thanks, Kenny. On to item C, system subject to the FSRP funding soundness restoration plan requirement, including compliance. Kenny, is that you also?
That is me.
Can you tell us which page on our?
Yeah, if we can go to page 36.
36, thank you.
All right, so we have essentially received one FSRP since the prior board meeting. We haven't received a formal notification of this funding soundness restoration plan, but University Park has submitted a new valuation, which indicates they actually switched to a closed 30-year employer actuarially determined contribution beginning back in 2017. And if you recall, University Park is the Telfer plan that closed its plan to new entrants and then moved all new hires to TMRS. And so they have submitted a valuation which indicates they've switched to a closed ADC. So they are our first plan that moves from immediately from this page where they just submitted to being completely removed from the list. So because they have a closed 30-year ADC, their effective amortization period will be whatever their that closed period is, because it's a single layer. So they should be fully paid off by 2047. We can move to the next page, please. So here we have a list of all the plans that are currently subject to an FSRP requirement or immediately subject to, who have not submitted a plan to us yet. There are no new plans from the previous board meeting. All of them were included in our February report, but I want to give a quick update on what's going on with the majority of the plans. Irving Fire had a city budget work session in May, where it was presented that they essentially have an 8% funding gap to get them to a 40-year amortization period. So at that point, the city discussed increasing their contribution by 3% to cover a portion of the gap. The system is also looking at incorporating benefit changes that equal approximately 3.4%. So it's not the full 8% gap to get them down to a 40-year amortization period, but it gets them much closer. And the benefit changes that the system is looking at is to introduce a second tier and reduce the guaranteed drop rate. And they're expecting to vote on those benefit changes in August.
Kenny, this is Kenny Ernest Richards. Quick question on the urban firemen's. The 3% increase, is it a one-time increase or is it every year 3% increase?
This is an 8% of pay every year That's the funding shortfall that they currently have. So when we were talking about the 30-year rolling amortization period before, this is essentially the same thing. So they have a fixed contribution rate, and in order to get themselves to a 40-year amortization period as of the date of the this analysis, they would need to increase their total contributions by 8%.
I see. All right, thank you.
If there's no additional questions.
I've got a question, Cherry Shivers. So I know that Irving Fire reduced their investment return rate once, and were they planning on doing it again?
There was, to my knowledge, there was no additional discussion on near-term reductions in their discount rate.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so if there's no additional questions, I'll move on to Midland Fire. And there's a board member on who can correct me or potentially answer questions later if they'll have any more detailed questions that I'm unable to answer. But they're currently in a multi-year process, and they're actually looking at making some fairly large structural changes to their benefits. The idea behind that being they want to fix it one time and make sure that it's fixed for the long term. So based on my conversations with their board members, they felt like they were making some fairly reasonable progress through 2019, and then they hit a few delays, and that's basically what they're waiting on right now. Essentially, that a new mayor that was elected late last year, about half of their city council turned over, and then shortly after that, obviously COVID hit, and that's what they've been dealing with up to this point. So they feel like they have the opportunity to make some large structural changes over the next year or two, but at this point, they're waiting to have some good discussions with city management. In the meantime, they are working on a proposal that with their actuary that will get them to the point that they need to be. And they indicated that there wasn't a specific timeline associated with that. It just takes time to come up with a good plan and then negotiate with the city and the members to make sure that it works for the long term.
Kenny?
Sir?
Keith Brainerd here. So with regard to Midland, the notation indicates that their actuarial valuation dated January 1st, 2014 showed an amortization period of 59 years. Was that, as far as you know, was that the first time they exceeded the 40-year threshold?
No, I don't believe that was the first time, but I think that was, so the FSRP requirement was introduced in the 2015 legislative session. And so I believe that was either the 2014 or the 12/31/2015 valuation was the trigger that first subjected them to this requirement.
Okay, has Midland submitted an FSRP ever?
If memory serves, the 12/31/2015 valuation was the valuation that subjected them to this requirement, and given the amortization period was under 45 years, they submitted an FSRP that indicated that they were currently in a position to within the requirements of FSRP, so they had not made any changes at that point. Now, my understanding is that they engaged a new actuary for their 2017 valuation, and from that point is when they started having the conversation. Their actuary came in, completed that valuation, and then started working on potential benefit design changes shortly thereafter.
Okay, so we've not seen an FSRP yet submitted by Midland, is that right?
Correct.
And so 6.5 years ago, 1/1/2014 was the AV date when we learned that they had an amortization period of 59 years. And so 6.5 years on, and we're still waiting and no changes have been made to their plan design or financing arrangements either, is that right?
I don't know if any changes have been made. I don't know if they between that point and now. I'm not sure.
Okay, we could find that out later. Thank you. That's all I have for now.
Okay. All right. If there are no more questions on Midland, Longview, if you recall, we provided an update at the February board meeting, and they had made a number of changes. They'd been working, and they were subject to an intensive review, so we went through that with them as well, and they outlined the actions that they had been taking since 2012 to kind of turn their plan around. That was culminated in some assumption changes and additional changes as of 12/31/2018. Those coupled with a poor asset year, I believe, in 2018, resulted in the infinite amortization period. Based on my conversation with their board chair, since the February update, they've not taken any additional actions. They're currently waiting for their 12/31/2019 valuation, which is due to them in July. And at that point, they will be assessing their current situation, but the board chair did indicate that he did not think, given the current economic environment, the city was likely to increase contributions anytime soon. If there's no questions, I'll move on. Orange Fire, we did provide some update in February on where they stood, but their FSRP wasn't actually due at that point. Since then, we've had a conversation where they indicated that their actuary presented a benefit design study in late 2019. Illustrated a number of benefit and contribution changes that would ultimately bring their amortization period down below 40. The city has committed to increasing their portion, their contribution that was included in that study. The employees have increased their contribution a little bit. They increased their contribution 0.3%, but it required a slightly larger contribution increase on the employee side, as well as additional benefit changes. Those have not occurred, and as of right now, one of the trustees that we spoke to said that they were having some difficulty convincing the members of the need to make those changes, as well as bringing the city and the firefighters together on agreeing on what additional changes need to be made. So as of right now, there have not been significant changes since the February board meeting. If there's no additional questions on Orange, Marshall Fire, their actuary recently completed an analysis reflecting the change in assumptions coupled with a contribution increase. The members voted last Thursday to include that contribution increase, which is a 2% for the members. The city contribution increase would also be a 2%. They're just now starting their budget process, so the system is in conversation with the city to make that change. Both of those changes together, without the assumption changes, would be more than enough to bring the plan under 40. The employee contribution, without the assumption changes, should be sufficient to meet the FSRP requirement. Not quite sure where with the assumption changes and just the employees, if that's going to be enough to get them down under 50 or not. But they're continuing to work with their city on making some additional changes and trying to get. So they haven't indicated the time frame on when we can expect to hear more, but obviously I think at this point they're waiting on the city to make some decisions. And finally, Beaumont is due next month, but we did have an opportunity to speak to them, and they are in the process of putting together a number of changes. It's going to require a little bit more time, but based on their time frame, it's likely that we will see something before our next board meeting.
Kenny,
If there's no question.
Kenny, this is Marcia Dush. 2 questions. Can you refresh us by stating what the rule for a FSRP is, like when are they supposed to have the FSRP due, and when are they supposed to be meeting the 40-year amortization requirement?
Sure. So just to make sure I cover everything, the trigger is a 40-year, an amortization of 40 years or more for 3 consecutive valuations if they perform them annually, or 2 consecutive valuations if it's less frequently than annually. Following the second or third valuation that actually triggers the FSRP requirement, the system and the sponsor have 6 months from the date that that valuation is adopted at a board meeting to formulate a funding soundness restoration plan. And then the FSRP due date that we're showing here is 30 days following the 6 months. So essentially 7 months after they adopt the trigger evaluation, they're supposed to be submitting the FSRP to the PRB.
And they have what, 10 years to get to a 40-year amortization?
Correct. So I apologize. The FSRP is supposed to be a plan that gets them to 40 years, 40 years or less within 10 years of adoption of the plan.
So essentially, the current FSRP essentially is a 50-year plan. You know,
To get to full funding. Yes, it's a 50-year plan to get to full funding.
Yeah. The second comment then is I appreciate the fact that these plans are working on achieving significant changes to meet the FSRP. But we're coming up on a legislative session. I mean, what is our responsibility? And maybe this is a question more for Keith or for Anu. What is our responsibility with respect to these plans that are late in developing their FSRP? Do we have any options as far as how to stimulate compliance here?
Can I answer that, please, Kenny?
Please.
It's Keith. We're going to be taking up in a minute the issue of FSRP statutes and possible recommended changes to the legislature. Right now, the FSRP, in my view, is very lax with regard to the standards and requirements, even to make it. And that is one of the issues that we're going to be discussing are these standards and the timing. So if you could give us just a few minutes to get to that, Marcia, we'll be taking that up in a few minutes.
Okay.
And good morning, members, Anumeha Kumar, if I can jump in very quickly here, please. We certainly want to be mindful of the process and the time period that it may require for these systems to work on their FSRPs in conjunction with their plan sponsors. However, the board certainly has the option, and I would recommend to invite some of these systems like Irving Fire, Midland Fire, and Orange Fire, since they are subject to a second revised, along with their plan sponsors, to the next PRB actuarial committee meeting, which is scheduled for August 6th, to provide an update on their FSRP progress. We certainly have precedent for that, and that helps continue the conversation both between the plan sponsor and the system, as well as keeps the board updated.
That meeting is a Zoom meeting. Am I correct, Anu?
I'm not 100% sure at this time, but most likely it's going to be a Zoom meeting again.
Which should make it easy for these plans to appear.
That is correct.
So I would agree with Anu that it would be good to get a personal update from these plans that are overdue.
Anu, are we slated for action on this item that we could take a vote to ask for those plans to come into the actuarial committee?
We don't have a motion, but the board can certainly ask for it, and we'll request the systems and their sponsors to appear before the actuarial committee meeting in August.
All right, Marcia, can we accept your suggestion as a motion to ask the plans that the staff identifies?
So moved.
Come and talk to the actuarial committee at our next meeting?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Seconded by Ernest Richards.
Thank you. There's motion and a second. Any discussion on that? Everybody understand the motion? Any discussion? Okay, all in favor of the motion to ask staff to ask for the plans on this list that staff suggests to please present to the actuarial committee at its next meeting in early August. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. It passes unanimously. Thank you. Kenny, is there more on the FSRP?
I have a little bit more on the next 2 pages.
Before we go on, I just have one comment. Is that under the statute as written, the board doesn't have any enforcement authority per se, other than inviting plans to come in and to do things voluntarily.
Yeah, we are the review board. We're toothless, but we can ask nicely. Kenny?
If we can move to page 38, please. So this is a list of the systems at risk. Plans show up on this if they have if their most recent valuation is 40 or above, but they're not yet subject to the requirement. There are a couple of new plans on here, but the thing I wanted to point out, I wanted to talk about with relationship to this particular list is Austin Police, because they've been in the news a little bit lately. So some of the Austin plans have been in the news, and Austin Police is on here. They conducted an experience study in 2019 that resulted in fairly significant changes to their assumptions. And that is a big part of their shift from 35-year amortization period to an infinite amortization period. But they have been working with the city, and the pension board recently made some recommendations where they're supporting a modest contribution increase for members, adding a new tier, as well as potentially introducing an actuarially determined employer contribution. The city council had a work group with a meeting by one of their consultants, which also included the potential for an employer actuarially determined contribution as well, or an ADEC. So that's the plans are currently. There's been a lot of coverage, I guess. So I just wanted to make a quick comment on that. And if I can move to page 39.
Before you move, Kenny, this is Ernest. So these funds are not yet subject to FSRP requirement. How long do they have to be on this table before they're subject to FSRP requirement?
So it depends on how frequently they complete evaluation. So any plan that completes valuations biannually, so every 2 years, it's just 2 valuations. If they complete the valuations annually, then it would be following 3 valuations. And a quick review, so Austin Police appears to be the only plan on this list that that completes annual valuations. So basically for Austin Police, it would be 2 more valuations. For every other plan on the list, it looks like it would be their next valuation. If it's over 40, then they'd be subject to the requirement.
All right, thank you.
Hi, this is Ashley Rendon. I was just, we have muted all of the callers, and I believe Mr. Stacy had a comment, and to unmute yourself, you can push *6 on your phone.
Will we be taking public comments at the end?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe Kenny had made when he was giving the overview of Midland, he talked about Mr. Stacy possibly having more information. And so I just wanted to make that for the.
I apologize. This is Kenny. I think that was for the public comment section if you wanted to provide additional details.
Yeah, let's wait till the public comments at the end, please.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Kenny, please proceed.
Sure. So if we can move to the next page. So this is just a list of plans that are currently working towards the 40-year requirement. And you'll notice University Park is down here. They're going to be moved off. So we have this secondary table, subtable, I guess, at the bottom, just to indicate here are the plans that were on the list and are now moving off, so they don't just disappear and we don't notice that they've moved off. So University Park and Harlingen Fire will both move off in the future. And if we can go to page 40. So this is a list of completed plans. The one item that is worth noting, and I didn't mention this at the joint committee meeting, but Dallas Police and Fire is very likely to be our first plan that completed the requirement and then will be subject to the requirement again, right? So they completed it, moved off the list, and then will come back onto the list at their next valuation. So based on conversations with the system itself, the reduction in their discount rate, as well as the difficulties that we're pretty much all aware of related to their assets and transitioning from where they were before, their amortization period is very likely to be above 40 on their next valuation. So they'll be at risk in their first valuation. They do complete annual valuations, so it will be 3 valuations that would require them to become subject to the FSRP requirement. But it's worth noting that the legislation that modified their plan in 2017 includes a requirement of the PRB in 2024 to identify an actuary to provide an independent analysis of where they are, but they're likely to become subject to the FSRP requirement prior to 2024 and prior to that requirement. So I expect that they'll be looking at making some additional changes and potentially submitting an FSRP sooner than legislation requires us to act. And that's all I have prepared for the FSRP report. I'm happy to answer any additional questions.
Other questions for Kenny, and as a reminder, we're going to be taking up the FSRP statutes and policies in general here in a few minutes. But specific questions about these plans for Kenny. Thank you, Kenny, thank you. On to funding policies received as required by Government Code Section 802/2011. As you may recall, last legislative session, a bill was passed that requires retirement systems in the state to submit a funding policy. And the actuarial committee heard about these, and I'm going to ask Ashley to share that information with the full board, please. Ashley?
Thank you, Keith. Good morning, members. So staff provided, I'm Ashley Rendon. Staff provided the initial analysis of the funding policies at the PRB's actuarial committee meeting on May 7th. And today I plan on giving a brief presentation of the material the committee heard in May, including both the compliance with the requirement and an overview of the content of the policies received. And then I'll wrap up with steps that staff took since that meeting at the committee's direction and request. So beginning on page 43, you'll see that as Keith mentioned, the Senate Bill 2224 added Texas Government Code 802/2011, requiring the funding policy that details the governing body's plan for achieving a funded ratio that is equal to or greater than 100%. And the first funding policies were due from systems on February 1st, 2020. So far, We have received policies from all but 5 systems, and we've been in contact with the majority of them. So we separated the information on the spreadsheets that follow this presentation by contribution policy. And so non-ADC includes fixed rate and other funding structures that do not receive the ADC. Modified ADC contribute on an actuarially determined basis, but may not receive the full ADC each year, and then ADC. And you'll see that we have funding policy development with sponsor. We want to highlight the plans whose funding policies indicate the adopted actions to be taken by both the sponsor and the system. And so you'll find in the spreadsheets that follow that a handful of non-ADC plans use stronger language in their funding policies, like the city will take certain actions. We've also heard from others that anticipate sending an update to their funding policy that will include risk sharing and sponsor involvement. On to page 45. You'll see in the following spreadsheets, we've broken it down according to our funding policy research paper and guidance document. And so we are showing risk sharing and contribution and benefit parameters that we found in the funding policies. We've included some examples here, such as for risk sharing, proportionate employer and employee contribution increases when the benchmark is not met, or for contribution benefit parameters, the plan considering contribution decreases or benefit enhancements only if the funded ratio or amortization period maintains a certain threshold after the action is taken. And on page 46, these next few slides after this one cover a pretty large element that we found in the policies for non-ADC plans, which is benchmarking. So 52 out of 55 of the funding policies utilize benchmarking. And on page 47, we've broken it down. You'll find that a majority of funding policies had closed period benchmarks, meaning that they are comparing their actual contribution to a benchmark that reduces by 1 year each year. There's another category here, which is closed with ultimate layered closed benchmark. And in this, the plan starts with the benchmark that reduces by a year each year until they hit the ultimate layered year, where they begin layering in gains and losses for their benchmark. So for example, you'll see 25 years to 15-year layered. They'll start at 25 years, it goes down to 24 and 23 until they hit 15-year, where they'll begin the layered benchmark. And then for open and rolling, in contrast to the closed or layered benchmarks, this one compares the actual contribution to the same benchmark year contribution every year. At the May actuarial committee meeting, the committee discussed the plans with rolling benchmarks and asked staff to reach out to the plans that indicate they have a rolling or open benchmark. At the end of this presentation, I'll ask Kenny to talk more about the conversations that the staff had with those plans.
And this is Marcia Dush. Before you go on, again, the issue there is that the law states that the plan, the funding plan, has to amortize the unfunded liability. You have to have a plan that ultimately funds the unfunded liability. When you have an open or rolling benchmark, that benchmark never gets to 100% funding. And so as an actuary, I don't see how an open rolling, a non-closed benchmark complies with the law.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we'll be bringing that up shortly. It does not comply with the law. You have to submit the law says that you have to submit a funding policy that gets you to 100%. and a rolling method doesn't get you there. We expect to have to take action on that here shortly.
Okay.
Thank you, Marcia. Ashley, did you have more?
Yes.
Please.
And so on the next page, on page 48, we also looked at the benchmark comparison. It was encouraging to see that funding policies included trigger actions and actions resulting from those triggers when comparing benchmarks to actual contributions or funding periods. The table on page 49 shows the various actions plans included, such as if the ADC benchmark rate differs from the plan's contribution rate, the board will, with the city, develop a plan of action to bring the combined contribution to the benchmark rate. And so we broke this down on this page. And the summary of funding policies from ADC and modified ADC plans. So for the ADC plans, I'll remind you that they are mostly offered by special districts. Many are supplemental plans. Most of these plans have long been on the path to full funding through the sponsor's commitment to paying the full ADC. And they deserve recognition because they're memorializing their funding structure into their written funding policies. And many of the ADC plans are well into their original closed amortization period, such as Dallas-Fort Worth Airport Board. They began with a 30-year closed about 15 years ago. They're on 14, they have 14 years left. And then we'd also like to highlight a firefighter plan under the Telfra statute, Denton Fire, Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. In their meet and confer, they included their funding policy, and which is designed to ensure payment of the ADC or a greater amount. And then there are 13 plans within modified ADC structure. Their contribution structures are based on an ADC. It's designed to eliminate the unfunded liabilities, even if they don't receive the full ADC each year. Many of those plans use risk-sharing elements to make up for the difference between the assumed and actual experience by spreading the unexpected costs between the sponsor and plan members. And then many of the plans, we did include this in the spreadsheet, they do not permit negative amortization, or they have a statement that discourages negative amortization. And this modified ADCs, those spreadsheets include plans that have strong funding policies memorialized in statute, such as the 3 Houston plans and Galveston Retirement Plan for Police, or also an ordinance such as Fort Worth Employees Retirement Fund. So we have broken down the amortization policies on page 51. You'll see that most are at or under 30 years, although there are some with rolling years that are also at or under 30 years. And I also wanted to make a note here that since the May meeting, again, where the committee requested staff to reach out to those plans with rolling benchmarks, there are plans staff communicated with, such as Dallas Police and Fire Pension System. And because through the committee's discussion and through our conversations with them, they actually have changed and updated their supplemental plans funding policy from an open period to a closed layered period. And so you'll see that change reflected in the updated spreadsheet that follows this presentation. And to talk a little bit more on those rolling benchmarks, staff first communicated with those plans prior to the actuarial committee meeting in May. And during the meeting, the committee discussed those rolling benchmarks and then directed staff to contact those plans. On page 65, we have included a letter that we sent to those plans to follow up as a follow-up to those conversations. And at this time, I'll ask Kenny to fill you in more on those.
Yeah, this is Kenny Herbold, staff actuary. So we reached out to all of the plans that have a rolling benchmark. Some of the plans indicated that they were already in the process of making a change or were considering making changes to those benchmarks to change from, because of the concerns that the board had raised. Although some plans did indicate that they felt the benchmark was reasonable for their current position, but that they would relay the concerns that the board had to their own board.
Kenny, this is Marcia. Will they be responding formally to the letter in writing, or what is the next step here?
We have not asked for a formal response at this point.
Members, Anumeha Kumar, the board certainly has that option to request a formal response from these systems that we can then bring to the next actuarial committee meeting in August.
Yeah, I would like to ask that the staff notify those systems that submitted a funding policy with a rolling amortization period that does not comply with the law. I think we have a responsibility to do that. If they're not in compliance with the law, we have to let them know and ask that they amend their funding policy.
So Keith, do you want them to present at the actuarial committee meeting or just respond in writing?
Yeah, I think that if they can just submit a revised funding policy, that ought to do it. And I would ask staff to identify a deadline. Anu, you and your team can identify an appropriate deadline, perhaps this fall.
Sure, we will reach back out to these systems and ask for a formal response or a revised funding policy, if that's what they wish to do, to submit or share with the actuarial committee in August.
Thank you. Do we need a motion for that, Anu, or is that guidance sufficient?
That guidance sufficient.
Okay. Ashley, is that the end of your prepared remarks on this item?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, I want to make a couple comments. I think a number of us on the board a number of months ago, maybe more than a year ago, were surprised to learn that most retirement systems in the state did not have a funding policy. Excuse me. A funding policy is basically a roadmap for how you're going to fund the plan. And it seemed that most systems didn't know, other than just having in many cases, a fixed contribution rate that was just going to go on. But obviously there are a lot of plans that do not have a framework in place to reach full funding, certainly over any reasonable time frame. And getting this legislation passed was a big deal. I think it's a huge step forward for pension plans in the state. I want to thank the staff for the compilation effort. This was a huge amount of information that I think was very difficult and complicated to present. And I think that the staff did a great job of organizing it in as comprehensible a manner as could have been done. And for those members who may not have gone through this, I would encourage you to go through this information. It's very interesting to see how the different funding policies got laid out. On the whole, I think it's really good. It's a big step forward for pension plans in the state to develop these funding policies. There's a few hiccups, but there also are a number of plans that some of which Ashley identified that included the plan sponsor in their funding policies and consulted with their plan sponsors, which really is what we want. And also a number of plans have got risk sharing arrangements or other triggers in place to modify their financing arrangements or benefit structures in case they fall out of their funding policy. And we'll be talking about pieces of this here in a few minutes with regard to the FSRPs as well. Anu, is there anything else that you want us to bring up with regard to the funding policies?
before that, Keith, I'd have a clarifying question that I think may lead to a comment. This is Christopher Zook.
Please.
So when I look at the actual spreadsheet, which I, again, commend the staff because it was an enormous amount of work to put all this together, but it really does help us, evaluate. But when I'm looking at the spreadsheet, and if you want to flip through to just page 56, just so everybody can see what I'm looking at on a separate screen, when I look at, the way that the ADC amortization period, the conditions that trigger actions, and then the actions resulting from the trigger, the risk sharing, et cetera, what jumped out to me, and I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly, that when I look at the middle section as an example, there's numerous instances where the board will notify the city and the member group association of the difference, i.e., the way I interpret that is I'm going to notify everybody there's a problem. And then the next statement in the funding policy is work with the city and active members to consider modifications to return the funding paid to the ADC benchmark. And that is used obviously a number of times here. So if I read that correctly, and this is truly a question, is there nothing that they have to do? It's just, hey, we are going to recognize there's a problem and then we're going to think about maybe fixing it? Or is there actually something in their policy that requires them to do it that I'm not necessarily seeing here without looking at the full details of every single policy? Please help me understand that.
No, Chris, you are spot on. Anu, if you don't mind, I'd like to respond to that. That's exactly right. Legislation that passed did not provide any trigger or any authority to the PRB or anybody else to require the plan sponsor to take action. At our last meeting, the actuarial committee did direct the staff to develop a recommendation for the legislature to include plan sponsors in the funding policy requirement. That was probably the major shortfall of the funding policy bill. In retrospect, I think it probably was best to pass it the way that it passed. Hopefully we can get this next leg passed. Well, the next step would be for the staff to come back to this board at our next meeting, presumably in the fall. And presumably we're going to vote on recommending that the legislature modify this statute that in order to require plan sponsors to participate in and sign off on the funding policy. And that will sort of complete the circle, because without the plan sponsor's involvement or commitment, the funding policy doesn't mean a whole lot. It's a big step in the right direction. It begins the process of identifying the liabilities and how they're going to get paid for, but the plan sponsor really has to be involved.
Keith, Sherry Shivers, just to piggyback on the discussion, is that the funding policy statute and the FSRP statute in general, I'd just like to add to the mix for consideration of, besides subpoena power, of maybe thinking about recommending to the legislature some kind of enforcement power for the PRB.
Thank you, and Sherry, thank you for that. If you'd be kind enough to pass on some more specific thoughts on that issue to the staff before the actuarial committee meets in early August, I think we would benefit from those.
Sure, I'll be glad to.
Thank you. Anu, is there more on the funding policy discussion?
Thank you, Chair Brainerd. Just to quickly jump on the question that Mr. Zook raised, to build on or add to the points that were made, the systems also have, specifically TELFRA plans have statutory parameters within which they have to work. And the point I want to make here is the language that pertains to the involvement of the active members. There is a requirement in their statute with regards to any benefit or contribution changes. Those have to put to a member vote. So you see that language throughout the TELFRA plans resulting from trigger column because of that reason. And in addition to the sponsors not being subject to this requirement, the systems did share concerns regarding their current statute and the parameters and the structure that's already laid out in their statute as as one of the concerns or areas that they couldn't do much about. So I just wanted to share that with the members.
And one last thought in response to Mr. Zook's question, and that is we are the Pension Review Board, and so far, by and large, the legislature has authorized this board solely to review, we don't have much authority beyond that, we can consider possible changes to that in the coming months in terms of recommendations for legislation.
Thank you for
Is that all on funding policies?
That's correct.
And any other questions for staff with regard to this issue? Thank you. On to the next item, review of funding policy requirement and funding soundness restoration plan. And I'd like to ask Michelle Cranes to provide us with an update on that.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. Michelle Cranes, Deputy Director. I'd like to build on Ashley's presentation and try to tie the funding policy requirement together with the Actuarial Committee's request to review the original statutory funding requirement, the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan. And that's because in our minds, these two requirements, while currently separate, can't be or really shouldn't be considered separately. And the committee raised concerns with both. Of course, the committee is reviewing these statutes in line with the board's statutory duty to recommend legislative changes that it finds advisable. I'm going to briefly review where Texas funding requirements have been over time and then present possible areas of improvement, some which were identified by the committee and some by staff at the committee's request. So on page 67 of the packet, we've presented a brief timeline. 5 years ago, the legislature enacted the FSRP statute to establish a framework for a plan and its sponsor to work together on a remediation plan to bring the amortization period back within 40 years over a period of not more than 10 years. This is triggered, as Kenny explained, by 2 to 3 consecutive valuations over 40 years. And if a plan doesn't, if an FSRP doesn't work to keep the amortization period approaching 40 within those 10 years, the plan and sponsor must revise the FSRP. 3 years ago, the PRB updated its funding guidelines to lower the maximum recommended amortization period to 30 years and establish a preferred target range of 10 to 25, urging plans to work to get to within 30 years as soon as possible, but by 2025 at the latest. And then, of course, last year, the legislature enacted the board's legislative recommendation to require funding policies that target 100% funding. The next 3 pages summarize the committee's discussions on both the funding policy and FSRP requirements from its last meeting, including 2 requests that the committee made of staff. We've included those 2 items in a comprehensive list of potential policy improvements on page 71. So that's where I'd like to go next, please. Okay. We've brought 10 issues for potential board consideration, and these range from quite broad in scope to more narrowly focused concerns. The first is an issue which applies to both requirements, and it's certainly the most broad, but we think it provides an overarching guide to reviewing these statutes. Because they were adopted at different times and pension funding standards have changed, the 2 requirements are not in sync with each other. From a policy perspective, of course, you might want the funding policy and remediation plan to operate in conjunction rather than independently. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I move on. Leading into the second issue, this was raised by the committee, and this is on the funding policy specifically. You've heard about this already, but to summarize, as Ashley and Chair Brainerd mentioned, a small number of plans developed their funding policy with the sponsor, but the committee expressed concern that most of the funding policies were crafted without the participation of a key stakeholder, being the plan sponsor. The third issue, Kenny spoke about previously, and committee members as well this morning. While most of the funding policies utilized closed ADC benchmarks, a small group of plans used rolling benchmarks, to compare their actual contributions, a practice that the committee found problematic for fulfilling the statutory requirement of establishing a plan that would achieve 100% funding. So the first issue raised with regards to the FSRP requirement, issue 4, is regarding the threshold that triggers the FSRP. And again, to reiterate, as Ashley explained, we were very encouraged to see that nearly all of the 56 fixed rate plans had adopted ADC benchmarks into their funding policies. All but a small number of those were on closed periods and periods that were at 30 or fewer years. So what that means is that nearly all of those plans will be comparing their actual contributions to a recommended contribution that decreases every year, as recommended by various standard setting bodies, in addition to the PRB's funding guidelines, and you'll see those listed here. You'll also hear about, you also heard about the potential changes to ASOPs from Kenny. The FSRP statute, in contrast, still uses a rolling 40-year threshold to trigger a remediation plan in collaboration with the plan sponsor. Moving to issue 5, it's related and it addresses the number of years that can pass between the first valuation over 40 and the development of an FSRP, years which one might consider lost time, so to speak, for addressing funding problems, which can continue to worsen during that period. And I think Ms. Dush pointed out that it can essentially become a 50-year plan to full funding, more than 50, depending on how many years it takes to trigger the requirement and then complete the FSRP. And I should mention that last session, there were several bills filed that would have brought the FSRP trigger down from 40 to 30 years. Issues 5 and 6 relate to the steps taken as part of the FSRP process, specifically whether a plan should include actions not yet taken, such as hiring additional staff or changes that require voting by members, and the analysis provided to evaluate the impact of those proposed changes. I wanted to highlight issue 8, which looks at the revised FSRP requirement. This issue is becoming increasingly relevant as more systems and their sponsors become subject to a revised FSRP. Currently, 10 out of the 18 FSRP plans have required a revised FSRP because the original plan would no longer reach a 40-year amortization period within the 10-year allotted time frame. One system, as you know, requires a second revised plan. For some of these systems, it can almost appear as if they're in a perpetual FSRP cycle to achieve a 40-year amortization period. Issue 9 looks at the time frame for developing an FSRP. We've seen a number of cases that took a while, even several years, for the political process to play out and yield a solution that both the plan and sponsor could agree to. And this ties in, I think, with the question I raised earlier of whether future actions can be included in a plan, because of course that relates closely to how much time the parties have to make those changes, such as holding member votes. I think this issue requires a real balancing act so that the parties aren't rushed to a solution, which could incentivize smaller changes that are easier to agree to than those that are really needed. But at the same time, you need to ensure that a restoration plan is put into action before problems worsen. Of course, we should remember that the trigger includes multiple valuations showing more than 40 years. So plans and their sponsors should have some idea if they're moving toward triggering an FSRP to begin exploring options for reform. And finally, issue 10 asks what should suffice for the progress updates required in the law, as well as what constitutes adhering to the FSRP, specifically for purposes of revised plans. On the next page of the packet, we've included a letter from TexPERS addressing the committee's initial conversations regarding the FSRP threshold, laying out their concerns, which we wanted to make sure that you received. And so in conclusion, what we're hoping for here is for staff to work with the actuarial committee over its next 2 meetings to evaluate these issues more thoroughly and work with our stakeholders to solicit their input before the committee brings potential legislative recommendations to the full board in November for consideration. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Before I open it up to questions, I want to emphasize these pages that Michelle just went through, because these pages really get to the heart of what this board is about. If you read nothing else from this packet, I encourage you to read the pages from 67 to 73. And of course, you'll want to read the Texper's letter that follows. These really are fundamental to why this board is in place. And we're hoping by the end of this discussion to get a motion passed that directs the actuarial committee to work with staff to develop a recommendation for legislation for the legislature coming into town next year in 2021 that will address a lot of these issues pertaining to the FSRPs. Getting the FSRP in place a number of years ago was a big step for this board, but obviously there are a number of issues and opportunities to strengthen this and clarify roles and responsibilities. And with that, I want to commend Michelle and Anu and the staff for the pages they put together there. Again, I hope you will all take time to read every one of those pages, and I would open up for questions.
Sherry Shivers, I've got a question. Were any of these issues addressed at all in the interim charges on either the Senate or the House side? Just curious.
I don't believe so, and Anu, if you remember differently, but my memory is that the charges were more, what's the word, higher level, and didn't get into the specifics of the FSRP. We can certainly check and let you know if they did.
That's okay, I'll check. Thanks.
This is Marcia Dush. Again, I think that the work that the staff has done to distill from our conversation at the actuarial committee meeting has been really good. And what I am particularly impressed with is that they are committed to involve all stakeholders. And so, Keith, I would be happy to make that motion to have staff go back and work with the actuarial committee to bring forth recommendations for legislation for the next legislative session coming about in 2021.
Thank you, Marcia. We have a motion to ask the staff to work with the actuarial committee to develop legislative recommendations for possible improvements to the funding policy and FSRP statutory requirements for the full board's consideration at our fall committee. Is there a second?
Yes, Ernest Richards, second.
Mr. Richards, seconds. Thank you. Further discussions, questions? If not, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much. We look forward to working with the staff and getting back with the full board at its November meeting. Our work continues. We had a joint meeting of the investment and actuarial committees. Was that in April, I believe? I'd like to ask Robert Munter, who is the one of the newest hires, if not the newest hire at the Pension Review Board, and who is a CFA, and also Kenny Herbold, who I think is among our newest CFAs, to provide an update on that joint meeting. And that was the first meeting of the investment committee, and of course the first joint meeting between the actuarial and investment committee as well.
Keith,
Kenny, Robert, please.
Keith, sorry, Anumeha Kumar. There is an item that we skipped, compliance reporting, the usual report that we provide to the board, please, before we get on to the joint committee meeting update.
Sorry. Brian, are you there? This is public retirement system reporting and compliance, including non-compliant retirement systems. Brian, I'm sorry. Please.
No problem. I am here. Greetings, members. My name is Brian Burnham. I'm a financial analyst with the Pension Review Board. I'll be pretty quick with this. I just wanted to go over some of the compliance situations for this board meeting. If you can see from this board meeting to last board meeting, we have 6 non-compliant plans currently. Of those 6 non-compliant plans, 2 of them are over 60 days non-compliant. The other 4 plans were from the September 30th fiscal year end dates. Of those plans, 1 of them actually is now compliant. These numbers were gathered last week as of June 22nd. And then 2 of the other remaining 3 have submitted at least 1 of the 3 reports that are required for compliance. Those reports are the financial audit, a report on membership as of the end of the fiscal year, and a report on the investment returns for the fiscal year end. Those 2 plans that are currently over 60 days, I'd like to focus on. They are plans that have been on this list in the past. We have the Nacogdoches County Hospital Retirement System and the Northeast Medical Center Hospital Retirement Plan. Starting with Northeast Medical, they were non-compliant for 2018 as well as 2019 at the last meeting. However, we have gotten in an audit from the plan, which made them compliant for 2018. The only report they are missing currently for their compliance in 2019 is the investment return report, the PRB 1000. We have recently been in contact with the plan. They said that the report is ready and would be sent to our office soon, but as of today, we have not received that report. And as far as Nacogdoches County Hospital District Retirement Plan, a brief background information, we've had issues with their compliance since 2017 when they initially left their third-party administrator of the Texas Hospital Association. Since then, it's kind of been a revolving door of contacts within the plan. Even most recently, we just received a new contact head with the plan this month. And we reached out to them and got a hold of them and were notified that they now have a new third-party administrator and principal financial group. And the information that we need from that plan has been forwarded to that group. And we have been assured that they are working diligently on getting those reports to us as soon as possible. And that would cover all I want to cover unless there are questions.
Thank you. Questions for Brian on compliance? Brian, thank you. And once again, I apologize to everyone for skipping that agenda item. Having already introduced the next agenda item, I won't do it again. I would just ask for members of the PRB staff, Robert Munter and Kenny Herbold, to provide an update on the Investment and Actuarial Joint Committee meeting.
Thank you. So my name's Robert Munter. I'm the investment analyst here at the Texas Pension Review Board. I will be going over the brief update and overview of the joint investment and actuarial meeting that we had back in early May. So first, during the investment portion of the joint meeting, we covered expected impacts to our pension plans and overall market performance that we were seeing as a result of COVID-19 and the impacts to the markets. Markets have continued to rebound since that meeting, but they have also continued to see some volatility as the reopening of the economy is continuing to progress. But as we are also seeing in some states, reopening may be more challenging than had been hoped. So we do expect that this volatility will continue throughout the year as we continue to monitor our plans and the market impacts. For the actuarial portion of the joint committee meeting, we covered 2 new metrics to help improve our monitoring of plans and trying to better identify plans that might require more attention. The 2 new metrics were the liquidity ratio and the asset to benefit payment ratio. Now, also during that meeting, we were asked to reach out to some of the plans that were coming up based off those 2 new metrics there and make them aware of the committee's concerns. We have done so and spoken to those plans and are working with them. But that would cover the brief overview that we have of the joint committee meeting. and I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Questions for Robert?
Robert, this is Marcia Dush. In reviewing those plans that have liquidity, that have potential liquidity issues, is there any plan that is in explicit trouble right now? Or is everybody making their benefit payments without being under duress at this point?
This is Kenny Herbold. Based on my conversations with the plans, they were all pretty much aware of the potential issues. You know, they're in conversations with their investment advisors and their actuaries. So the short answer is no. No one was in immediate distress, and no one indicated that they expected to run out of assets in the next couple of years either. So they all indicated that they were working to make sure that they didn't run into any issues, and they were aware of the issues that they're likely to have over the next couple of years.
Good, thank you.
If there are no other questions, Madam Chairman, that completes the report of the Actuarial Committee, and I'd like to give it back to you.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is we have an update from the Investment Committee. And for that item, I will call on Christopher Zook, who chairs that committee for the board.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So we met at our joint meeting, and we have on the agenda to discuss today the investment practices and performance evaluations as required by the Government Code 802.109. And I will ask Robert Munter to provide that update.
All right, thank you. So again, this is Robert Munter here. So providing just a brief update on the investment practices and performance evaluations. So real quick, just as a quick reminder of what this requirement is that Senate Bill 322 from last legislative session instituted a requirement that plans with assets greater than 30 million must submit an evaluation due to the PRB by June 1st. The requirement for that evaluation is a public retirement system shall select an independent firm to evaluate the appropriateness, adequacy, and effectiveness of the retirement system's investment practices and performance, and to make recommendations for improving the retirement system's investment policies, procedures, and practices. So far, we are expecting 65 evaluations to be submitted from our plans. So far, we have received 50 evaluations. The remaining 15, we have sent reminder emails to on June 15th, and as well followed up via phone and email with those plans. And for that 15 that are remaining, we have been notified that 11 are in the process of getting us the evaluations. 2 were unsure of the current status of the evaluations, and 2 we have not been able to get in contact with. We do understand, though, that these plans may be experiencing disruptions due to COVID-19, which may have affected the ability to timely submit the report to us. The PRB is committed to working with these plans that have been impacted and are experiencing these delays. Now, we do have an investment committee meeting coming up later at the end of July, and we will at that time be providing more details on these evaluations as we are still continuing to work through reviewing them right now. But with that, open for any questions.
Any questions for Robert? Obviously, for all those that are in attendance, I would just make the request that if you have not already turned in the performance evaluations and practices report, please do so as quickly as possible so we have time to adequately review them before our committee meeting, and that way we can be as best prepared as we can be to review those. So thank you, Robert. Any other questions for Robert? Okay, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is we have an update for the Education and Research Committee matters, and for that I will call on Marcia Dush.
I'm sorry.
Marcia.
Anu, I'm going to ask you to take us through that.
Sure, you can call on Benjamin Warden to provide that report on MET compliance.
Okay. Benjamin Warden, would you give us the report on MET compliance?
Absolutely. Good morning, members. My name is Benjamin Warden. I am a research specialist with the Texas Pension Review Board, and I will be providing the MET update. As a brief reminder, the PRB adopted rules earlier this year that changed the reporting date for MET reports from twice annually to once annually, due on September 1st of every year. As a result of that, we will not be giving MET updates at every board meeting, but instead we will provide them at the first board meeting following the September 1st deadline, and on an as needed basis. If you have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them. If not, that concludes my report.
Any questions?
Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, very good. We'll go on to our next agenda item, which is our 2020-2021 legislative appropriations request. And I'll turn that over to Anu.
Thank you, Chairman Leiby. We need to make a correction. It should be 2022-23 LAR request, so I apologize about that. We don't have a prepared document. I just wanted to go over some of the potential requests that the staff is currently working on. And we have not received the legislative appropriations request instructions yet, but our LAR would be due before the November board meeting. So we wanted to make sure we have a brief discussion about these potential requests with the board. Given these are difficult budgetary times, of course, we want to be fiscally responsible and mindful of that in making those requests. And to that end, staff has identified at this point two priorities that we wanted to bring to the full board. And we do have a motion for this particular agenda item. All state agencies were asked to come up with a plan to identify a 5% reduction to their current 2020-21 appropriation. And we submitted that plan, of course, to the Legislative Budget Board and to the Governor's Office in anticipation of, or if those 5% reductions are applied to the 2022-23 appropriations, then staff is recommending that we request a restoration of those reductions. Last session, the legislature graciously appropriated an additional FTE to the agency that brought us up to 13 FTEs. However, as you all know, over 90% of our budget is tied to staff salaries. So if we were asked to, or if our baseline was lowered by 5% to us, that would essentially translate into losing an FTE, and that would be a big blow to the agency given our current workload. Staff, again, tends to be stretched thin, and an additional reduction would have a big impact on a small budget that we have. So we would be requesting, or staff is recommending that we request a restoration of that 5% reduction if that were to happen. The only other item that staff is recommending relates to our IT needs that we have been evaluating for a few years now. And again, in light of the current budgetary situation, we are being conservative in what we want to ask there. We tried to identify what is the most salient need that we have right now with regards to our IT needs. And we do have an antiquated internal database that we would like to upgrade essentially, or do a lift or shift of. And we are working with our IT consultant to determine a cost associated with that, but we anticipate that to be under 5% of our total agency budget. So those are the only two items that staff has identified at this time to include in our LAR request. And members, we do have a motion on this, essentially to direct staff to work with the board chair and vice chair to finalize our LAR request, which hopefully the instructions will come out soon and would be due either sometime in late July or early August. And that concludes my presentation.
So at this time, the chair will entertain a motion to direct staff to work with both chair and vice chair to finalize the 2022-2023 legislative appropriation requests. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
And is there a second?
Ernest Richards, second.
Perfect. Motion has been made by Mrs. Dush and seconded by Mr. Richards to direct staff to work with the chair and vice chair to finalize the 2022-2023 legislative appropriations requests. Is there any board discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it and the motion is passed. Next item on the agenda is the executive director's report, and I'll turn that over to Anu as well.
Thank you, Chair Leiby. The first item on that list pertains to our 2021-25 strategic plan, and you will find that report in the meeting packet starting on page 114. Members, the development of this plan requires a forward-looking or a long-term assessment of the agency's goals and also strategies to achieve those goals. Majority of the goals that we have identified in our current strategic plan relates to our general duties. And this document that contains our goals and strategies, of course, as well as our budget structure, helps agencies, is going to help us communicate our goals to the stakeholders, including the governor and the legislature. So this document is an important piece of the entire budget process that we go through that culminates into our general revenue appropriation come next session. So we have already submitted this report to the Legislative Budget Board and to the Governor's Office, and we wanted to make sure you've had the opportunity to look at it. The next item is the customer service survey. Now that's part of the strategic planning process that agencies are required to conduct a broader survey every other year. And we did that, and we have included the report of the survey in the meeting packet as well for you. First, I would like to, of course, thank all the participants of our 2020 survey for taking time to share their thoughts and providing their valuable input to us, which we take very seriously, and we will make sure we use the comments and the response that we have received to inform future agency actions and the work that we do here. Just a few quick notes on the customer service survey. We did have a higher response rate in this go around as compared to our 2018 survey. Part of the reason why that was the case is because we focused our attention or directed the survey to our constituents that we work with on a regular basis. For example, trustees and administrators who take our training, or our stakeholders who attend our board meetings, our retirement systems, of course. So given that, the response rate was higher than 2018. The highest overall satisfaction percentage that we received was related to staff services. essentially the category that had a question about how satisfied our stakeholders were with agency staff, including the courtesy, friendliness, that received the highest score of 93%, and we are very proud of that. We strive constantly to make sure that we provide a high level of customer service to our constituents. The area that I think the agency will have to do some work is our complaint handling process that required the lowest satisfaction percentage. However, I would like to note here that this particular question, we could do a better job of posing this to our constituents, did receive the highest number of NAs or neutral responses, and given the way we rated the responses, was part of the reason why the percentage was so low in that category. So we would certainly look into that. And finally, again, I would like to both thank the staff that conducted the survey very well. This was an anonymous survey, of course, and we wanted to make sure we receive as candid response from our constituents as possible. And there are some areas based on the comments we received in our survey that we will be considering to look at. For example, we received a few comments asking the PRB to work on the continuing ed courses. So our trustees and administrators could take their continuing ed, fulfill their continuing ed requirement by accessing online courses like they're able to by accessing our core MET. And so we will be looking into that, of course, because of the limited number of staff and resources that we have. That is one of our priority projects that we have been looking at, and hopefully we'll be start focusing in that area here soon. And then the only other comment that I think we need to work on improving related to our website, and given our budgetary constraints, we try our best to continue to improve on our website, but that's an area we would be looking at as well, given the comments we received. Members, if you don't have any questions, that concludes my customer service survey presentation. Thank you. Hearing none. The next item on the agenda relates to staff update. First and foremost, members, I would like to thank our staff. They have been working very hard during these difficult times to make sure we continue to focus on and make progress on our core mission. And so I would like to thank staff for continuing to do that. And of course, our stakeholders that we work with, they're very supportive, and I wanted to mention that as well. We do have good news to share. We have a new hire who's going to start with the agency tomorrow. His name is Joshua White, and I believe he's watching the meeting right now. So hello, Joshua. Joshua has a bachelor's from Berkeley and has just completed his MBA from Macomb School at UT. And he brings direct experience in public pension policy from his work with the California legislature. And we are very excited to bring him on. Members, the last point that I wanted to make regarding staff update is we do have a hiring freeze right now. So we have one vacant position that we are unable to fill because of the hiring freeze. If and when that changes, of course, we will revisit and look at filling that position. But right now, we are at 12 FTEs, including the new hire, who's Joshua, who's going to start tomorrow. And we do have a vacant 13th FTE position that we will carry on until we hear otherwise from the legislature. So that concludes my staff update, members. If y'all don't have any questions, I'll move on to the current 2020 operating budget. We are very much on track. And given there's a hiring freeze, we will have some funds to lapse that we, of course, because of the hiring freeze, we will be giving it back to the legislature. But other than that, our operating budget is on track. The next item on the agenda pertains to the approval of the fiscal year 2021 operating budget. We have included a copy of that in the meeting packet for you to look at, and we do have a motion for our 2021 operating budget for y'all to approve, please.
At this time, the chair will entertain a motion to approve the fiscal year 2021 operating budget as presented.
So moved. This is Christopher.
Motion has been made. Is there a second?
Second, Keith Brainerd.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Zook and seconded by Mr. Brainerd to approve the fiscal year 2021 operating budget as presented. Is there any discussion from the board? Okay, on the motion made to approve the fiscal year 2021 operating budget as presented, all opposed say aye. Sorry. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the fiscal 2021 operating budget is approved as presented. At this time, I also call on the board for any future PRB agenda items that they would like to consider at our 2020 or at a future board meeting. Okay, hearing none, we'll move to the next agenda item, which is date and location for future PRB meetings. For the full board, the next board meeting of the PRB will be held November 12th, 2020. Between now and then, we will also have investment committee meetings and actuarial committee meetings. The investment committee will meet July 28th. The actuarial committee will meet August 6th. And then on September 29th, both committees will also meet, though in separate meetings. So on September 29th, there will be a meeting of the actuarial committee and a meeting of the investment committee. And now at this time, we will move to public comment. And so I'll turn that back over to Ashley to call on those who have pre-registered.
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, we have muted everybody, and so to unmute yourself, it is *6 on your phone. And we only had one member of the public pre-registered, and that was Mr. David Stacy.
This is David Stacy. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay. Is it appropriate for me to speak at the moment?
It is appropriate for you to speak.
All right. I would like to correct some errors that were commented on earlier in the meeting regarding specifically Midland's FSRP. Midland was first required to submit an FSRP November 1st of 2016. Midland, in fact, submitted an FSRP in compliance with the law on October 31st of 2016. A subsequent evaluation showed that the amortization period went from 44.7 years to an infinite amortization period, or unable to amortize. That was calendar year end, December of 17. We're in the process of doing an actuarial evaluation in the calendar year ending 2019. That is not done. It's in the process of. It was the interpretation of the Pension Review Board that because the FSRP we had submitted in 2016, and then we had an evaluation that showed an infinite amortization period, that we were no longer in compliance with submitting an FSRP. Because we were already engaged and have been engaged for well over 5 years in trying to evaluate impacts and true liabilities to the plan. Of these details, I would be happy to discuss with them at as much length and as much detail and as much resource as anyone on the PRB would like. But for the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that at the moment. But I do think it's important that there were comments made, and of course this is recorded and it's on the record, that Midland has never submitted an FSRP and therefore is 4 years past due. That is completely in error. And I take strong exception to the fact that while I am for the PRB staff, I have a long-standing track record of being supportive of PRB and the PRB staff. And I still am supportive of the PRB and PRB staff. However, the board in this discussion earlier today was talking fairly high-level information about compliance or non-compliance of a particular fund. In this case, it was mine, of which I have intimate knowledge of, and completely incorrect information by staff was given. That brings to question how much information is accurate or inaccurate or incomplete in any discussions you have. Now, with that being said, moving on to the comment related, or the discussion related to the FSRP amendments, or FSRP rule statutory proposals. FSRP was first required, as Midland was one of the first plans required to submit one, was first required in November 1st of 2016. We're only 4 years into this plan at this time. Not even four full years into that plan. In that period of time, there has been significant pressure been brought to bear by the power of suggestion, if nothing else, by the Pension Review Board for plans to lower many of their assumptions. The two primary assumptions that repeatedly have been discussed at meetings have been the investment return assumption, context of the discussion being too high, and the payroll growth assumption, context of that discussion is also too high. Plans, almost every plan, in fact, I think every plan now in Texas under the PRB's purview has in fact lowered their investment return assumption. Some of them more than once. That has a negative actuarial impact to the plan, or at least it has a high liability, increases the liability cost to the plan, which has a subsequent increase, all things being equal, to extending the amortization period. Because every plan in Texas to some extent has lowered their investment assumption, and still the data shows from your source, the data that's provided on the PRB website, that the majority of plans have moved to a lower amortization period. Certainly there are outliers, but I think it is unfair to characterize the majority of plans in Texas as all going to pot. If you look at the relatively short window of time since the first FSRPs were required, there has been progress by the majority of those plans in reducing their amortization period. And I would also point out almost every one of those plans simultaneously were lowering their investment assumption, which means they're going above and beyond the requirement of the FSRP by itself. I think it's unwise to look at a long-term plan and a long-term solution with short-sighted vision and with a sense of urgency that the sky's falling because we're not seeing the results we want quickly enough. I really think that's not keeping in spirit of what the FSRP was all about. And to the extent that the PRB agrees at some point that they're going to participate in proposed legislation to amend the current FSRP law or current FSRP statute, you're changing the rules in the middle of the game for those plans that have already submitted an FSRP, are acting in good faith in making progress in those FSRPs, and then forcing them midstream to turn around and start over again. And I must remind you that the process of running a pension plan is far more than complying with whatever report the PRB needs or wants. The role of a trustee is to weigh all of the measures related to all of the factors related to running a pension plan, which is investing the trust assets wisely, prudently, making sure that the administrative needs of the plan are met, that the benefits are paid on time, to whom and in what amount they are promised to be made. And in the process of all that, working with both the employee group, which is the membership of the group, and in many cases the membership drives directly the plan design, and the employer or plan sponsor, and bringing all these groups together on a regular basis and keeping them together. And it doesn't stay that way. Most plans meet typically once a month. Y'all meet even less. I was saying y'all, the Pension Review Board, being less. I'm not saying you need to meet more, but nothing happens on a dime. You set out a grand plan, a grand direction you want to go. The FSRP statute in 2015 laid out that grand plan related to some sort of plan to reduce the overall number of plans with a high amortization rate.
Okay, Mr. Stacy? Sorry. Yeah, so thank you for your comments. We are coming to the end of your public time allotted time period, but I do welcome you, to join us at the actuarial committee meeting, and we're more than happy to continue this discussion as we move through the process related to these recommendations.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Anumeha Kumar, very quickly, please, if we could go back and reopen the FSRP agenda item so staff could clarify. I do believe we made a mistake and we just wanted to be on record and clarify the FSRP for Midland Fire.
Very well.
Thank you.
This is Kenny Herbold, staff actuary. I do want to apologize. Mr. Stacy is correct. I misspoke when I said that they had not submitted an FSRP. So I went and looked up the timeline and looked at the details so I could respond to Keith's original question. So the valuation that triggered their FSRP was the January 1, 2014 valuation as he asked. The FSRP that they submitted, as Mr. Stacy indicated, they submitted in October of 2016 before the initial deadline. The FSRP indicated that their projections of their amortization period was under 50, and therefore they were in compliance with the FSRP requirements at the time, and no actions were going to be taken at that point because they were on a trajectory to be under 40 within 10 years as required by the FSRP requirements. Subsequent valuation, as he indicated, with the 12/31/2017 valuation date, did indicate an infinite amortization period, and the way in which we evaluate whether the plans are adhering to the original FSRP is whether the subsequent valuations or any subsequent projections indicate they are still on a trajectory to hit 40 within the original timeline. And because that the infinite amortization period indicated they wouldn't be under 40 by 2026, we had issued a letter indicating we did not believe they continued to be in compliance, and that's how they moved back to the immediately subject to list based off the 2017 evaluation. So I just wanted to again apologize that I spoke on those details and clarify for the record what actually.
Thank you. I think, does any board member have any comments or questions? Or are we good to close that agenda item? Okay, very.
Chairman, I move that we adjourn.
Oh. Okay. I think just prior to that, we will just open it briefly just to see if there are any other members of the public who have any comments. If they would like to speak up, please unmute your phone and announce your name at this time. Okay, very good. Hearing none. At this time, I will accept Vice Chair Brainerd's motion to adjourn the meeting. Is there a second?
This is Christopher. I second.
Very good. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Okay. Any opposed? Any opposed? Nay. Very good. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.